Alrighty, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. Today we're going to be discussing, are you ready for how the October 1st, 2023 MDS changes will affect the other state assessment for Pennsylvania? A webinar featuring a recording by Carrie Weaver from Myers and Stauffer and Ruth Ann Bernard of the Office of Long-Term Living. So we wanted this training for the Pennsylvania OSA training to be directly provided by Myers and Stauffer. And we are going to be showing a video recording of that today. My name is Casey Stevens, and I'm a communication specialist with Quality Insights. Joining me today is Deborah Wright. She will be co-hosting with us. She is a quality improvement specialist with Quality Insights and helping answering your questions and monitoring the chat during today's presentation. Deb, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Everyone has entered the meeting on mute, but we will have a discussion following the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please submit them using the chat or using the Q&A tool in your Zoom menu. You can also raise your hand to request to be unmuted and ask your question aloud. And we also want to invite you to join us every Wednesday at 2 p.m. for more of our weekly webinars. And tomorrow we're going to be discussing the MDS changes and highlight sections G, 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 H, and I. So without any further ado, we're going to get rolling on the video presentation.
Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So today we are going to be talking about, first off, kind of the title is a little bit backwards here. Title is the new OSA and the overview of the MDS. But what we are going to also be talking about is just a little bit of an overview of the MDS 3.0 item sets and CMS guidance that we have so far surrounding that. We just, at this point, in a final state, what we have from CMS is the MDS item sets that will be effective October 1st of 2023. We do not have the REI manual. We have it in draft form, but not in a final form. So what we're going to be doing today is going over basically the item sets and the major changes to those item sets. And then we're going to be going through the use of the OSA in Pennsylvania. Our October training will go into details on the new MDS items and all of the coding guidance and that kind of thing. So we can look forward to that in October. My screen's not advancing. There it goes. I'm sorry. Okay. So here is just a list of the item sets that are available starting October 1st, and you'll notice that the OSA is not on there because the OSA is no longer a federally required assessment. So it's an assessment completely on its own. So with that, in addition to the REI manual, you're going to have a secondary manual, which is also available on the CMS 3.0 website that is an OSA manual. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so we're just going to go through an overview of the basic changes. And again, this is the basic changes of the item set. So there are 22 new and modified MDS items. There are 13 care area triggers that are updated, 17 care area assessment worksheet areas updated. Section G is completely removed from the federally required assessments. There is a change to the PHQ-9. You will now be required to do what is called a PHQ-2, and depending upon the answers of those two questions on the PHQ-2, you will proceed to the full PHQ-9. Throughout the manual, and this again is the draft manual, there is a change to all gender neutral language has been updated throughout the manual. And then there are an implementation of some SPADES items. 6 new categories of SPADES data will be collected on admissions and discharges beginning October 1st, 2023. And of course, that SPADES data is the data that is congruent across all post-acute caregivers. So those areas are related to ethnicity, race, language, transportation, health literacy, and social isolation. And we'll talk more about that as we continue through the slides here. Okay, so the changes to Section A. Section A 0300 has been deleted. There is not a replacement for that. A1000, here we see the changes to the race and ethnicity questions. There's an additions. This is basically an expanded choices for response here. And then also the resident was unable to respond and the resident declines to respond. A1100 for language, it's renumbered and A and B are reversed. Marital status is removed. A1250 is transportation questions. This is a new item. So it speaks to just transportation availability and if it has kept the resident from appointments and that kind of thing. If they don't have an issue with transportation and then the resident being unable to respond or declines to respond. A1800 is just a renumbered area for the where the resident entered from. So there are a couple of expanded choices here. And as well as A2100, which is the discharge status. So it's renumbered and there are some additional options. Again, this is an overview just of the item set. There will be a more detailed training on the item sets and the coding guidance when that final coding guidance is available from CMS. A2121 and A2122, these are new items. This is speaking to medication reconciliation. Medication reconciliation between providers is very important, so that is newly being tracked. As far as the reconciliation itself and in what form the reconciliation was presented. A2131 and A2124. New items. This is reconciliation at discharge. So when you're discharging them to home to another provider, there is an expectation of medication reconciliation and then a notation of the method or the route of transmission of that reconciliation. Section B. Section B is some changes or some new items on health literacy, B1300. And this just asks how often the resident needs help with questions to read instructions, pamphlets, and other health-related literature. D0200 is the resident mood interview. This is, like we talked about, this will be effective October 1st of 2023. This area is renamed and renumbered. It starts with the PHQ-2, so you'll proceed to the first 2 questions, A and B, and depending upon those answers, you'll follow the instructions to either proceed through the remainder of the PHQ-9 or not. Total severity score is renumbered, although the instructions and the criteria for depression, the numbering system remains the same. So social isolation at D0700 is a new item. Go into section G. Of course, section G is removed. One thing to note about section G, I think we all know that there are elements or items for section G that do factor into the quality measures. And CMS has released no information at this time as far as what they might be doing with those quality measures, if they might be freezing them, if they might be replacing them. That's yet to be announced from CMS. And the latest information that I have from CMS from any source is from the March 2nd, 2023 CMS Open Door Forum, where they said that quality measures would be released later this year, and details to any changes would be coming later. So keeping my eye out for that. So then we have, moving on to section GG, we have 0120. So this is moved from G0600. It's renumbered to GG0120. And the terms in the last 7 days is added to the coding instructions, but otherwise this is a familiar item. Changes to section J. We have a renumbered J0410 from J0400. We have a little bit of a change, J0510, pain's effect on sleep. So this is split into a separate item and renumbered. The questions revised just a little bit. J0520 is the pain interference with therapy activities. This is a new item. J0530, pain interference with day-to-day activities. This is a split item now, renumbered, revised questions. Couple of changes to section K. So section K 0510, this is renumbered. All of the questions will look familiar. The coding will be a little bit different as there's an updated assessment period here and coding instructions to fit each of the 4 new and revised assessment timeframes. So you'll be coding for 4 different timeframes moving forward as of October 1st. You'll code these items on admission, while not a resident, while a resident, and at discharge. K0710, percent intake by artificial route. This is, there's an updated the completion requirements to account for the additional columns in K0520. A couple of changes, overview changes for section N. We have updated coding instructions, 2 columns here, so an additional column and 2 additional drug classes to be coded here. Revised title and renumbered. So we now have N0415 high-risk drug classes with the 2 drug classes of antiplatelet and hypoglycemic added. And you will code if the resident is taking those medications and if an indication is noted. Some changes to section M. So O0110, special treatments, procedures, and programs. This is a renumbered area from A0100. Here again, many of the questions are very familiar. It is that there's an additional breakout to some of these items, and there is an additional column. So in addition to coding the items, you'll code them on admission, if they were present on admission, while a resident, and at discharge. O0600 and O0700, these 2 items, physician examinations and physician orders, will be removed from the federally required assessment. So you will no longer see this guidance in the REI manual, nor will you see these questions on your federally required assessments. A couple of changes to section Q. So section Q, there's a reformatting and retitle and renumber to at Q0110, and this is the participation in assessment and goal setting. Then residents' overall goal, again, this is reformatted, retitled, and renumbered. Q0550 is the resident's preference to avoid being asked questions at Q0500B. So shorten the title a little bit, even though it's still a long title. Updated the item to stress that the listed people other than the resident should be asked only if the resident can't understand or respond. So a little bit of clarification there. It's simplified, reformatted, and renumbered. Q0601, the referral, just simplified and renumbered. Q0620, the reason for referral to the local contact agency. This is a new item. There are a couple of items that are existing on the MDS. So again, these items will be familiar to you. However, in the past or prior to October 1st of 2023, these items were not on the MPE assessment. So you will expect to find on the MPE with any assessment that's opened with an ARD of October 1st of 2023 or after, that the MPE will include Z0100 through C0500, which is the BIMS interview. It will include C1310, the signs and symptoms of delirium, D0100 to D0160, the mood interview, and J0200 to J0530, the pain interview. The slide in front of us, this talks a little bit about the transition between assessments as of October 1st, 2023. So as you are aware, after having looked at the changes, there are a lot of MDS changes that are effective October 1st. Significant changes, omissions, and addition of many MDS items. So the target date of the MDS is what identifies the required version of the MDS item set. And because of the substantial changes in the MDS item set, they're not interchangeable. So what this means is that any assessment that flows over the October 1st, 2023 date, providers will not be able to change target dates on an assessment that cross over that date. Meaning if you need to make a modification of a ARD or a target date, you can't do it back and forth over the October 1st. So if you had an assessment that you opened for October 1st and you really meant to open it for September 30th, you won't be able to modify the October 1st back to the September 30th and vice versa. They would be different item sets, so that modification would not be able to occur. Okay, now we're going to move on to the second half of our presentation. And the second half of this presentation is on the optional state assessment. So the optional state assessment is just exactly how it's titled. It's an optional assessment that the state is able to use as of October the 1st, 2023, in order to maintain their ability to classify resident assessments into RUG groupers. Because you'll note, as we, through the slides that we just spoke about, there are items in there that are now going to be removed from the federally required assessments, namely Section G and orders and visits. So those items can only be captured through the use of the OSA. As of October 1st, 2023, Pennsylvania will require the use of this optional state assessment. So the intent of the optional state assessment is that there is maintenance of the RUG case mix program. Several items have been removed from all federally required assessments. These items remain on the OSA for the purpose of calculating a RUG 3 grouper for Pennsylvania. So the items on the OSA that remain and are no longer on the federally required assessment are A0300, D0300, K0510, O0450, O0700, D0200, G0110, O0100, O0600, and X0570. So these items that are listed on this slide are all of the items that are no longer on your federally required assessment. Instructions for completing the OSA can be found in Chapter 3 of the MDS, as well as the OSA user guide. Again, it's going to be required October 1st, 2023. There will be a required concurrent OSA that will need to be completed with the same assessment reference date on each federally required assessment submitted for all Medicaid certified nursing facilities. This will allow for the RUGS-based case mix score to be calculated and the current RUG-based reimbursement methodology to continue beyond October 1st of 2023. You do not need to do an OSA for any tracking or discharge assessments. The OSA, again, is not a federally required assessment, but rather it is required at the discretion of the state for payment purposes. Just to reiterate, the OSA will be required to be completed concurrently with all OBRA and PPS assessments that are federally required. The OSA is not required with any discharge assessments, nor is it required with any entry tracking. Only facilities that accept Medicaid payments will be required to complete these assessments. And the OSA is always opened as a standalone assessment, as it cannot be combined with any other assessment. So you're unable to combine it. You will be opening it with a ARD that matches every PPS and every OBRA assessment that you open and submit. You will submit a corresponding OSA. It is recommended nursing facilities start reviewing their internal software systems for OSA compatibility prior to October 1st of 2023 in preparation for the implementation of the OSA requirement. We did have a training in a preliminary training in June regarding the OSA, and there were a lot of questions regarding functionality of software systems. Those kind of questions are questions that we cannot answer on our end. They would need to be addressed directly with your software providers. So what will not change with the OSA use? The CMI process in Pennsylvania will not change. The field office baseline review process will not change. And the current reimbursement system will continue without change. And there will be no changes this year to Section S. So, you know, really the reason that that OSA is being calculated is so that all of the items on slide 50 can remain the same. So as far as getting your resident rosters for your CMI, all of those items will be exactly the same process of reconciliation and submission. Field office baselines will be unchanged. And there's no change to, you know, the CMI values, nothing like that as far as this October 1st, 2023 goes. So OSA submissions will follow the same submission requirements of the assessments that they are completed for. An OSA assessment would never be submitted without a corresponding OBRA or PPS assessment with the same ARD. These assessments do not need to be submitted in the same batch. So what that is saying is you would never submit a standalone OSA assessment that would not coordinate with an OBRA or PPS assessment, because the only reason that you're completing that OSA is to be able to generate a RUG score at the same time as that OBRA or PPS. So we need to have both of the assessments coming in with corresponding ARDs. Again, they do not need to be submitted in the same batch. Both of those assessments would need to be submitted by your cutoff dates for your CMI quarters. If an OSA is not submitted with a concurrent ARD of a submitted OBRA or PPS assessment, the assessment would be considered non-valid for reimbursement purposes, and the non-valid resident assessment RUG score and CMI value would be assigned to the resident. So this is saying if we were to, at the end of the cutoff period, if we were to have just an OSA and there would be no corresponding OBRA or PPS assessment, that assessment would be non-valid, and a non-valid RUG score would be assigned. Concurrently, if an OSA is submitted without a concurrent PPS or OBRA assessment, the assessment will not be considered valid for reimbursement purposes. So the first scenario here is if an OSA is not submitted. So you go ahead and you complete your OBRA or your PPS, and for whatever reason, it's missing that OSA piece. We won't be able to process a RUG score for that assessment, and it will be considered non-valid. The CMI value that corresponding non-valid CMI value would be assigned to that resident. The next scenario is if an OSA is submitted without a concurrent PPS or OBRA assessment. Again, we're only using that OSA to be able to generate a RUG score that corresponds with the PPS or OBRA. So if we get just the OSA, that will not be considered a valid assessment. And it will just be basically as if no assessment had been submitted at that point in time. Okay, some more on submissions. So OSA submissions will follow the same submission requirements of the assessments they are completed with. So that means if you're submitting the OSA that corresponds to the entrance or the admission assessment or the 5-day assessment, you're on the little bit of a tighter time frame for completion and submission than you would be the quarterly or a significant change. So again, the submission requirements, the deadlines are aligned with the assessment that they're being completed with. OSA would never be submitted without a corresponding OBRA or PPS assessment with the same ARD. Again, there's no purpose to a standalone OSA. If an OSA is not submitted at the time of the federally required assessment with the same ARD, therefore this resident would not have a valid assessment and would be considered non-valid for reimbursement purposes, and the non-valid resident assignment would be assigned. If an OSA is submitted with a federally required assessment, the OSA assessment submitted would not be considered valid for reimbursement purposes. So just kind of a reiteration of that. You just want to make certain that with every OBRA and PPS assessment you have a corresponding OSA with the same ARD. So why can't Pennsylvania just transition to PDPM and not have to do the OSA? And the answer to that is that RUGS 3 is written into legislation. So it takes a legislative change to be able to transition to PDPM. And that legislative change is in the works, but as far as October the 1st, Pennsylvania will need to use the OSA in order to maintain that RUG system. We do know that CMS has stated that the OSA will not be allowed to be continued after October of 2025. So the OSA is a short-term stopgap until the state, any state that continues to use a CMI process, has a new process in place. And Pennsylvania is currently working on the legislation to move to PDPM as its payment system. Okay, so now we talked about the completion, the submission, when an OSA could be non-valid, when it could not be considered if it's sent in or submitted with as a standalone assessment. Now what we want to take a look at is the actual optional state assessment, the form and completion of the MDS item sets. So the items that we're going to take a look at on the following slides are the items that differ from the federally required assessment. So there are many items on that OSA that are going to be identical to the MDS items on the federally required assessment that you're completing it in conjunction with. So there are many things that are going to be able to be copied over into this optional state assessment. They're going to be identical. The things that we're going to go through on the following slides are the items on the OSA that are not identical and will need to be completed on the OSA form independently. So the first of those items is A0300 and the coding for the actual optional state assessment. So at A0300, you have two questions. Is this assessment for state payment purposes only? Your answer at question A0300A is going to be yes. At A0300B, your answer is going to be a 5, other payment assessment. Pennsylvania does not use any of the other indicators or potential indicators for an OSA. So your answer for A0300B will be 5. It's an other payment assessment. Again, this is just the coding instructions. We'll enter a 1, yes, it's required by the state for payment, and a 5 at A0300B for the assessment type. D0200, the resident mood interview, the PHQ-9. So when we were in the first part of the presentation, we talked about the federally required MDS item set changes and the allowance for a PHQ-2, and dependent upon that, the answers to that PHQ-2, you would proceed through the entire PHQ-9 or not. That would be a federally required rule or regulation or guidance. But as far as your corresponding OSA, you will still continue to need the full PHQ-9. So the reason that this will need to be filled in independently, you won't be able to just copy this over, is that if you remember from earlier in the presentation, this item has a numbering change. So the old assessment is the D0200, therefore it won't copy from one assessment into the other because it's numbered differently. So you'll have to complete the entire PHQ-9 for every OSA that's completed. Questions are still the same, will remain the same as they currently are. And here again, in red, the full PHQ-9 will be required for the OSA. So while the PHQ-9 process changes for all federally required MDS assessments as of October 1st of 2023, the OSA still requires the full. So you'll follow for the federal assessment, the coding instructions over there, and then the full PHQ-9 on the OSA. D0300, the total severity score, there are no changes to the total severity score calculations or score impact on the RUG classification. G0110, activities of daily living. Of course, these section G items are no longer on the federally required assessments. So you'll code them on the OSA at G0110. All of the rules for coding remain the same. The rule of 3, the coding convections for section G. What we do have on the OSA is the ADLs that are limited to the 4 late loss ADLs. So you will not need to code all of section G, simply the 4 late loss ADLs of bed mobility, transfer, toilet use, and eating. Here is just the screenshot of what that OSA looks like with those 4 late loss ADLs. You'll continue to code that exactly as you do. Like I said, the same coding instructions, column 1, column 2, self-performance and support. The rule of three algorithm remains the same, so you would continue to follow that for section G on your OSA. Then we have nutritional approaches, K0510. Again, this looks exactly as it looks today. This is the way you will continue to code section K0510 on your OSA. The reason that this will need to be coded independently on the OSA and would not be able to be copied over is the numbering changes and the item set changes from the federally required assessment. Between that and the OSA, there's the numbering changes. So you would need to code these items. K0510, coding instructions remain exactly as they are today. Then we move into O0100, special treatments, procedures, and programs. And you'll remember from earlier, the federally required assessment now has these numbers. Item sets changed, they're renumbered. The item set choices are expanded, and the delivery times are expanded on the federally required assessment. For the OSA, they'll remain as they are today. You'll code just chemotherapy, radiation, oxygen suction, and you'll code it just for the two columns, the while not a resident and while a resident. While we were talking earlier, of course, on the federally required assessment, we have lost the O0600 and O0700. However, for the purposes of RUG calculation in Pennsylvania, these items will be required on the OSA. X0570 is just the optional state assessment and where you would do the modification for an optional state assessment. I do just want to talk a few minutes on the modification process for assessments. So there are some items that cross over both the federally required assessment and the optional state assessment, and there are some items, of course, that do not. So in Pennsylvania, we of course do use section S. So if you have any changes or modifications that need to be made for an assessment in section S, you would go ahead and make those modifications just as you do today. You modify that original assessment, the federally required assessment, because of course section S is not on the OSA, and then you will not need to do anything as far as modifying your OSA. As long as you've submitted that OSA with the same ARD prior, you do not need to do any type of modification of your OSA. So for section S, you just need to modify that federally required assessment. If you are modifying on your federally required assessment any item that is also on your OSA, you will need to make the corresponding modification on that OSA assessment as well. Okay, just some additional updates and training. We do have the resident data reporting manual in a state of revision right now. Again, there are not a lot of changes to the actual process for reimbursement. It will basically be changes to which item set codes are going to be utilized for drug classification, which will change basically to the OSA. So again, the process and everything in the data reporting manual will be very, very similar to what it is. There's very little change there. The REI Spotlight, we can continue to distribute the REI Spotlight quarterly. I have very recently got a lot of requests for addition to the distribution list for the REI Spotlight. That continues to be a very Pennsylvania focused change document. So if you are not receiving that REI Spotlight, you will, and you have not given me your email to be added to that list, since the June distribution. You can email me, kweaver@mslc.com, and I would be glad to add you to that distribution list. Anybody that's been added since June 1st or has sent me an email since June 1st, you have been added to the distribution list, and our next RII Spotlight will be sent out in August. Of course, we're awaiting the final rule, which usually comes out in August, and we're awaiting the final RII manual and coding guidance and that kind of thing. So that coding guidance and the full details on the MDS item set changes will be the topic of the October training, which is listed here as well, October the 12th at 1:30. We are not going to take live questions today. I want to make sure that everybody gets all of the answers to all of the questions, and we have time to answer them appropriately. So if you send any questions that you have regarding any of the topics of discussion on our presentation today, you can either send them to the QA-MDS@pa.gov, or you can send them to me, kweaver@mslc.com. The REI Spotlight request for sure comes to me, kweaver@mslc.com, and I'll get you added there. We will respond to individual questions, but in addition to that, we will put all of the questions that come through on this presentation. We will add those to the RII Spotlight. Additionally, any updates regarding the OSA, any new information between now and October that we may have, you want to just make sure that you're signed up for the Office of Long-Term Living listserv. There are emails sent out through there. And then again, the RII Spotlight, which will be coming out in August. So if there's anything that's changed or new that can be shared, we certainly will have that in that August RII Spotlight. So I want to thank you all for your time today, and we'll move through this change process together. So again, any questions, just direct them our way, and we'll make sure to disseminate those answers. I think probably with this new change, I will go ahead and email maybe a frequently asked question document to all registered users after the presentation as well, so that you'll get timely answers and won't have to wait until August to get them. So any questions, just let us know, and we will again get through all of these changes together. All right, thank you for joining me this afternoon, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, so that was Carrie Weaver from Myers and Stauffer. So a couple key takeaways that I just want to point out and re-review. First of all, we did find the actual PDF of the PowerPoint, so we will be sending that out after this presentation to those that have attended. So like it or not, we're probably going to be doing these OSAs until October 1st of 2025, unless legislation is approved before then. We all know how Pennsylvania is sometimes with legislation when it comes to our reimbursement. So we can be hopeful, but the maximum amount of time that we'll be doing these OSAs is, like they said, until October 1st of 2025. So the one question that came up, would you review again when modifications to federal versus OSA MDSs are to be completed? So just to recap a little bit, if your SNF is a Medicare or Medicaid duly certified facility, you are going to be required to do the OSA MDS, even if that particular resident is not Medicaid eligible. So even if they're private pay, if you are a duly certified facility or an MA only facility, you will have to do the OSAs, and you would do them in conjunction with every OBRA and PPS assessment, except for the discharge or the entry trackers. They have to be the same ARD. So if you are doing the federally required MDS, you are doing simultaneously an OSA with that. Where the modifications come into play is if you are doing the federally regulated MDS and you are only making a change to the Section S responses, you only need to change the federally required MDS. If you are changing any section on an OSA, you need to modify the OSA, but you also need to do a modification on the federally required MDS. So the modification has to match on both of them. There are times where, as MDS staff, we like to copy MDSs, especially for like those 5-day managed care MDSs. So this is a time when probably copying those MDSs are going to be beneficial, because all the areas that we were excited to lose in the federally required MDSs, we're still going to have to do in the OSA. So we're going to copy that MDS into the OSA, and then we're going to open the OSA and go in and, what I like to say is, clean it up a little bit and answer any other questions that are present on the OSA that were removed from the federally regulated MDS that's going to go into effect on October 1st of 2023. So I hope that helps answer that question a little bit. The other thing that I wanted to point out, it was said in an educational session that I participated in, and I thought, you know, this really is a great time to do this. As we are meeting with our teams and we are determining, okay, what do we need to put into play to make sure we're capturing the information that we need to capture for the MDS that's going to be effective October 1st, 2023. This is a time to really review our processes. So if you have something in your admission packet from a Department of Health or a UMR survey that happened 10 years ago, do you really still need to be capturing whatever it is you're capturing? Maybe you do, but maybe this is a time where you can say, okay, I'm adding all of these additional questions on, say, ethnicity or their transportation needs, the medication reconciliation. Do I really need to ask this other question? Do I do anything with the information that I'm gathering? So just take a look at that and make sure that as you're looking at what do you need to add, is there things that maybe you could take away, or things that you're gathering information on, but you're not using it or doing anything with it? It's a great time to really review that whole admission team process and the admission nursing process, so that you can, you know, get the most out of what you're gathering and what are you using it for. So let's see what's in the chat here. What if you're doing a managed care 5-day that's not submitted and not any OBRA assessment? In that case, I would say you are just doing the managed care 5-day, because those managed care 5 days do not have any impact on our CMI. They don't have any impact on anything other than that insurance payment. So you're really doing that managed care 5-day for payment purposes only from that managed care. So if you're not doing it in conjunction with an admission assessment or a quarterly or a SIG change, and it's strictly a managed care 5-day and nothing else, then at this point in time, I would say you do not need to do an OSA. Does anyone have any other questions? If you do, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A, and Casey can, you know, review other things we have coming up. Can you explain transportation on the MDS? Yes. Just give me 1 second. Casey, if you want to do your part, and I'll find the answer for the transportation.
Absolutely works for me. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to invite everyone to tomorrow's webinar where we are going to discuss the MDS changes in sections G, G, H, and I. That webinar will be tomorrow at 2 p.m. and I've added a link to that in the chat. And next Wednesday, August 23rd, we're going to be covering MDS changes J, K, L, and M, also at 2 p.m. We also invite you to bring your questions to our virtual live chats every Tuesday and Thursday at noon. Deb will be there to answer your questions on topics such as quality improvement initiatives, infection control, or MDS coding. You'll find the links to those live chats in our webinars and the newsletter we send out each Friday called the Last Minute Lowdown. If you want to receive that letter but don't, please email me and I'll add my email address in the chat so that way you can have it on file. And we want to thank everyone for joining us today. And before we sign off, Deb's got a couple questions that she's going to answer, as well as soon as you leave the webinar, we would ask that you complete a short evaluation of today's webinar. It is anonymous and will show as a pop-up as soon as the webinar ends. If you have a few moments to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. We will be sending out a PDF of the presentation as well as a link to the recording of it from today as well. All right, Deb, back to you.
All right. Thanks, Casey. So to answer the question that's in the QA quickly, on our managed care, we do 5-day admission. Do we also do an OSA? So yes, you would also have to do an OSA because that admission assessment is an OBRA assessment. So in this case, you're actually going to be doing 3 assessments. You're going to be doing your admission, and then if you copy it to finish your managed care 5-day, you're going to do that, and then you're going to copy it and do your OSA. So yeah, the managed care, in addition to doing 2 assessments like we're doing now, we're now going to be doing 3 assessments. So it is something we all can hope that legislation gets passed before October 1st, 2025, because it is going to be a lot of extra work for us. So I'm going to just share my screen from a previous, from the MDS series that we're doing, just so that you can see exactly the transportation. So the transportation is going to be at A1250, and they're asking, has a lack of transportation kept you from medical appointments, meetings, works, or getting from getting things that you need for daily living? And the answers are yes, it has kept me from medical appointments. Yes, it has kept me from non-medical appointments, meetings, work, or getting things that I need. No, the resident's unable to respond, or the resident declines to respond. And this section is, it's what the resident says. So you are going to ask the resident, in the last 6 months, has a lack of transportation kept you from all those things we talked about? I'm just going to summarize because for time. And you're going to ask them how they feel. If they're unable to respond, then we can ask a family member or a significant other. And if they're unable to respond and there's no family members, then we can use the medical record for documentation. If the resident declines to respond, doesn't really matter what the family or significant other states. If they decline to respond, that's the answer. They decline to respond. So again, here's the coding. If they say, yes, it has kept me from it, we would code A. If they say, yes, it has kept me from doing things I want to do, going to non-medical appointments, meetings, or work, we would code B. If they say, we would code no. If they say that there is not a lack of transportation for all those things, we would code X if they're unable to respond, and we would code Y if they decline to respond. So here's just an example of a resident that was admitted with MS. They were confused, unable to understand when asked if they had a lack of transportation that's kept them from medical appointments, meetings, work, getting for things they do. There was no family present. and their medical record indicated that the spouse uses their car to transport the resident where they need to go. So in this case, we would code C, no, and X, resident unable to respond, because in most of these sections, the resident unable to respond, we would code that so that we know that the resident didn't respond, but we were still able to get the information from other sources. So we would code, like I said, we would code no and X, resident unable to respond, because the spouse says that they take them to all of their appointments. And do you have recordings, handouts from previous webinars? And Casey has put the link. If you go to our multimedia resource page and go down to archived webinars for the series of trainings that we have done on the MDS up to this point, they are there under archived webinars where you can get the PowerPoints as well as the recordings. So if there are not any more questions, we will end this webinar. And then, like I said, we have every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, we're continuing our series on just reviewing the changes that are occurring come October 1st. And we can take your questions there as well. Will this question only appear on the admission? I believe so. Let me just double check, but I believe it is only on the admission. Yes, it is only on the admission assessment. And I keep looking because, you know, all of this is new, and those of us that do the MDSs as long, you know, we refer to our manual as our Bible. So I always like to go back and make sure that I'm given the correct answers. All right, so Casey, I will turn it back over to you, and I thank everybody for attending.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Deb. And just as a reminder, the slides and the link to the presentation will be emailed out hopefully this afternoon, but if not, tomorrow morning. Thank you all so much for attending. And if you guys have a moment, feel free to answer that brief survey whenever you leave the webinar. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.